Hello, I'm Dawn Durham, and welcome to PaTTANpod. We're talking today specifically about English learners and the ways in which we can make instruction rigorous, robust, and impactful. Joining us today on PaTTANpod is Dr. Aida Walqui. Thanks, Aida, for joining us today. We're so excited to be talking to you about this very important topic and making sure that we think about our English learners and all students who are in our classroom and making their instruction more robust. So we're excited to have you.
Exactly. Yes, thank you. It's equally a pleasure. And I like what you said, that it's thinking about English learners and all other students, but always beginning with English learners. Because if we think first of designing curriculum, enacting lessons with English learners in mind, we'll be serving all other students. But if we start with a generic idea of who students are, then we're not amplifying enough for English learners.
I think that's a good way to start the conversation, so thank you for that. I want to get your opinion and your thoughts on this. The practices regarding English learners haven't seemed to kind of keep pace with research. Why is that? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that it parallels to a large extent what's going on with general education. You could say that the practices in most schools in the United States have not kept pace with what we've been learning from research and from excellent schooling elsewhere. And I think it is, I mean, there are several reasons, but the most obvious reason is that our teachers don't have enough time to develop their expertise. It is a well-known fact that we are the only developed nation where teachers work so much in the classroom with students. In countries where students do well, for example, as judged by PISA results, what you have is teachers who teach 80% of the day or who teach even 70% of the day, as is the case in Finland. And then they devote the rest of the time to comparing notes, to planning lessons together. If, for example, all third grade teachers or all social studies seventh grade teachers get together, they plan a lesson in robust, exciting, and very stimulating and well-supported ways. Then they go and teach and come back with student artifacts, and they together reflect on the lessons, and then they can really enhance them and perfect them for future application. So there is a lot of not just time, but the supports so that teachers focus on different aspects of their expertise and they can grow together. In the United States, at best, a high school or a middle school teacher has one prep a day, but that prep comes and goes very fast, and sometimes teachers are even asked to substitute because a teacher was absent during that time. So less emphasis is paid to the development of expertise, and oftentimes people think that, you know, I've heard principals say, I need to hire some very good teachers. And they think that if they hire a very good teacher, then they'll have a very good teacher for the next 30 years. And the truth is that life changes. There are new demands placed by emerging societies, by tensions in the world, by inequities in the socioeconomic system, and thus different requirements are placed on education. And so teachers need to constantly be updating their skills because the landscape against which they teach is continuously shifting. And we haven't done that. For the most part, you could say that American teachers teach in the same way in which they taught back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And of course, life has changed dramatically, and that is not reflected in their expertise. But, you know, if we don't provide teachers with supports, where and when are they going to learn those skills? So, you know, having reading groups and discussing and videotaping and videotaping lessons and reflecting collaboratively, all of that takes time. And I think that that's one of the most pressing needs of reform in American education, giving teachers time. But on the other hand, I would hate to dictate giving them time without having planned what are the multiple activities that should go in that growth portfolio. So the portfolio of practices that develop the expertise of teachers needs to be thought out in very challenging, well-supported, and rigorous ways as well.
I want to circle back to a couple of things you said here. I think it is interesting to think about how what we're talking about really parallels all areas in education, that classroom practices really have not kept up with what we know about learning and our students. So I think that's a problem kind of all around, as you had indicated.
It is.
But really, you had talked about, the question becomes, is there time devoted to improving instructional delivery? And it sounds like maybe there's not, and maybe that's where we need to look at it. But and also you had said it has to be purposeful and thoughtful and meaningful, so that time that we do get to improve instructional practices is used well.
Exactly.
And used to its most impactful sense. Now, let me think about, when we think about equitable practices, and you kind of started to go in that direction, what do you suggest can be implemented to ensure equitable practice for all students?
Well, I think equity begins with multiple points of access into curriculum that, first of all, needs to be relevant, needs to be enticing, and needs to really have students working at the edge of their competence so as to continuously push it forward. I think that well-intended efforts to simplify things for English learners end up depriving them of opportunities to develop good thinking skills, good analytic practices, conceptual understandings, and definitely the language that is needed to convey them. To me, for example, one of the most revealing practices is to send educators to shadow a student for a day. And then inevitably they come back and say, oh my God, this needs to change. Because, teachers think, how can a child sit down, and perhaps there is a bright spot in the day, but for the most part, it's flat and mediocre, and children are silent. And we know, this is not brand new, because obviously it comes from the 1930s when Vygotsky developed the ideas, but the sociocultural ecological theory has kept developing. And now we know that if a child is not invited to engage in communication with others around central ideas connected to their fundamentations and the questioning, then they're not learning. And if judged by that alone, the regular child, Diane August has a paper that says speaks 2% of the time during the day. And that is tragic.
That is tragic. And it's really not, and you kind of have said this, that we oftentimes think we have to slow down or reduce the content or the academic rigor, and really we want to accelerate students. Any student who may be struggling in the classroom, that really it should be about acceleration, not remediation.
Exactly.
And that's kind of the viewpoint and the perspective that we need to take with all of our students, particularly our English learners.
Definitely. When you interview students, they in a class where things are simplified, the first thing they tell you is they think we're idiots. It's not, the act is totally transparent to students. When instead a teacher presents them with vibrant themes and exciting activities that, no matter how challenging, are well supported, they grow and they know this is exciting. The demands are there, but the supports are there as well. And so I love coming to this class. 8 years ago, I did a study where we both shadowed and interviewed students. And students would tell you openly in high school that I never go to second period class. That class is so awful. I never go. I said, well, let's go and see what it's like. And invariably, they were right. And there are classes where the challenges are minimized and where no supports are offered, but they're needless anyway. And so students thrive in situations where it is evident that teachers think they can manage it, and they assume the responsibility for assisting them in accomplishing that.
Well, then on that note, how do teachers scaffold? How do they offer those supports? What kind of things should they be thinking about and putting in place to ensure that students aren't saying, well, I'm not going to second period because it's awful, but they're going to second period saying, man, I'm really challenged there. I'm excited to learn about that. What do we do?
Well, I think that to begin with, teachers need to have a theme well chosen, a theme that they have themselves researched and studied. For example, if they are working on the concept of revolution in world history, then they need to know a lot about multiple revolutions, and they need to understand what do people need to know essentially about revolutions. The fact that there is a status quo and that people are unhappy with it, and there is a dramatic change in the way society does things. So those ideas are at the core of the notion of revolution. And then they are instantiated through either the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, we can talk about the third electronic revolution. I mean, we can talk about any that transforms society significantly. But oftentimes, I have found that teachers do not really feel comfortable with the notions they are teaching. They haven't had the time to review several texts. They haven't had the time to opt for one that is rich, that has great examples that students would love. And that is what teachers working together could do. They could say, okay, in 2 weeks, we need to teach revolutions, and we're going to choose 2 revolutions to really apply the different concepts we are learning. And so let's go and find materials. Let's bring them. Let's analyze them together. Let's see how we, for example, divide those materials, what sections of the materials work, what not, for what purposes. And that teachers don't have the time to go to libraries. They don't have the time to sit down and decide why is this text better than the other. And they don't have the time to themselves brush up their own knowledge and enhance it. Because the more a teacher knows about something, actually the more the teacher can dissect that something into its essentials and the interconnections that are preferred in the discipline. But oftentimes teachers teach because it's this page and the next page and the next page, whatever is there. But if you ask them what is the essence of what you're teaching, sometimes they themselves have difficulty. So if a teacher doesn't understand, I need to, by the end of this week, have my students understand these essential ideas, these essential interconnections, and then everything they plan is directed as steps on a road to reach that destination, then teachers are not doing that. I mean, today, for example, teachers are asked to write on the board, what are the objectives of the class. So there's a content objective, there's a language objective. And oftentimes they write nonsense, and it's never fulfilled in one period, but it doesn't make sense from day to day. They're atomistic objectives. They don't amount to anything. They produce superficial knowledge, which is, I can repeat this, that, and the other, but I cannot generate new understandings based on the knowledge that I have developed. Instead, what we need to aim for is depth of understanding, where students can really tell you what are the key ideas related to a theme and how, for example, they have occurred across a variety of instantiations. So it goes back to teacher knowledge of their subject matter, and then it's followed immediately by teacher pedagogical knowledge. So teachers, knowing their students, have to decide, how do I prepare the supports that will help them work beyond their ability in order to develop it? And then thirdly, teachers need to observe how students are taking up opportunities, what we now call formative assessment. We used to call it interactive assessment. And it's assessment of learning. You're observing students in order to offer them new learning opportunities, depending on how they are interpreting, misinterpreting, applying different operations, mental operations, and how something needs to be strengthened and something else needs to be skipped. So that, I think, a teacher that lacks subject matter knowledge, and that works equally well for kindergarten or even for pre-K, reading a book, a storybook, and deciding what is this book in essence about. It's not about the details. The Hare and the Tortoise is not about a race and a tortoise that wins, that is lazy. It is about an important lesson about persistence. And so teachers need to begin to point students in that direction from the get-go.
So scaffolding really comes down to making sure that as the instructional leader in the classroom, I see the interconnection, but then I'm also able to address that interconnection with the students and go in depth so that we can see some transferability of that knowledge. And this is what it means when you persevere. This is how it, in this situation, this is what it looked like, but in this situation it looks something different. So it's those interconnection pieces.
Exactly. It's about central ideas, their interconnections, the use of analytic thinking, and all of that makes knowledge generative. You can now, using that knowledge, recreate it in multiple other novel circumstances.
And I think that's something that as we move forward and think about scaffolding for our students, for all of our students, that's something to keep in mind. So I appreciate you bringing that to our attention and for talking us through that. And I'm so glad you came by PaTTAnpod today. And I want to ask you, and we ask this of everyone who visits PaTTAnpod, because we really want to inspire others to grow. What advice might you offer to those who are listening to this episode to inspire them to grow?
Well, I think if you're on your own and you don't have the privilege of being able to sit with colleagues who teach the same lessons as you do, it's good to just read on your own and decide, does this reading move me? Is it something that I really like, and why? Because if you, the teacher, like it, then your students are bound to like it. But if you, the teacher, thinks it's bad, there's no way you're going to stand up and convince anybody that it's going to be worth making the effort to understand. So, but also, I think developing your own understanding about issues. I was never a social studies teacher by preparation. But when I wanted to teach in high school, I was offered a social studies job. So I started reading by myself and became expert at a number of things because I read a lot and I tried to distill what is the essence of this concept and how is it going to come time and time again. But each time we revisit it, it's going to be expanded and deepened, and students will be able to talk about it right in better, more comprehensive ways. So I think that's it, to embrace the fact that we are intellectuals. Teachers are intellectuals because we try to entice students into the world of ideas. And so if we want to entice them, then obviously the enticement needs to be attractive. And we need to like it ourselves, because then if we do that, things become much easier.
So read and learn. I think that's good advice for all of us.
Well, work with a peer. I always suggest to teachers, find a like-minded soul and begin exchanging lessons, ideas, and be honest. Be honest and say, I blew that. Because there is a lot of lying to ourselves and lying to colleagues that goes on in school. And sometimes we don't do it even on purpose. For example, the amount of talk students do. I work with teachers and I say, read this article. And they say, 2%, no way. Our students talk much more than that. I said, okay, let's go and visit classes. And we go and visit 4 or 5 classes, and they come back and say, 2% is too much. So we justify in our heads. And because 2 or 3 kids respond, we think our lessons are very interactive. But then we fail to see that the 3 are the same 3 most of the time, and that what we have in our classes is the most inequitable of circumstances, because the rich are getting richer, and the poor, by remaining silent, are getting poorer and poorer all the time.
So find that buddy. I think that's a good piece of for any field, but particularly in education, to have that like-minded individual to observe, ask questions, push you, and challenge you a little bit. So I think that's excellent advice. Aida, thank you so much for stopping by today. We're so glad that we had the opportunity, and we look forward to future endeavors here in Pennsylvania with you. Thank you so much.
I look forward to that as well. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you in the field. You inspire educational growth in your students every day. A special thank you to John Ragsdale for producing this podcast. We'll see you next time on PaTTAnpod.